Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, simple. We take your sources, your notes, all that research, and we zero in on the absolute must-know insights. You know, the surprising facts, and just enough context to make you feel genuinely well-informed.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut to understanding some pretty complex topics.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into a company that's been, a defining force in interactive entertainment for, what, over 4 decades now? You've given us a ton of material tracing their history right up to today.
We are talking about Electronic Arts, EA, and specifically that massive division, EA Sports.
So we're going to unpack your sources, starting way back with EA's founding in 1982 and bring it all the way up to May 2025.
It's quite a story, really. You've got this journey from a kind of revolutionary artistic vision
Right.
to building a multi-billion-dollar sports empire. And along the way, navigating some really significant business model shifts and, well, facing down some intense industry challenges and controversies, too.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where does it all begin? We have to start at the very beginning, right? With that spark, the genesis, and that unique early philosophy back in the 80s.
That story really starts with Trip Hawkins. He'd previously worked at Apple, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and he founded Electronic Arts in May 1982. Initially, he funded it himself with about $200,000 of his own money.
$200. That's some serious bootstrapping for what it eventually became. And he didn't just want to make games, did he? He had this idea that felt, well, pretty revolutionary back then.
He absolutely did. His core philosophy was all about elevating the people who made the software. He wanted to treat software development as an art form and the developers themselves as software artists.
That feels so different from how the industry typically operated then. Developers were often just, anonymous coders. Their names weren't exactly splashed on the box.
Not usually, no. Hawkins wanted them to get recognition, like authors on books or musicians on albums. He genuinely believed that recognizing them openly would attract the very best talent out there.
So it wasn't just a nice gesture, it was strategic.
Exactly. It was a strategic business move. Get the best talent, you get higher quality games, and that drives commercial success. Simple as that, really.
So it was both that belief in creativity and a really smart way to get a competitive edge.
Precisely. And even the name reflects that. They were briefly called Amazing Software, apparently.
Glad they changed that.
Yeah, but in November '82, after some brainstorming sessions, and Hawkins apparently admired the film studio United Artists, they landed on Electronic Arts, tying into that whole software artist idea.
And that original logo,
Yeah.
the square, circle, triangle thing.
That was meant to symbolize creativity, technology, and entertainment. Those were the 3 pillars he saw for interactive media. Hawkins also pushed for a development model that was more collaborative, kind of like film production.
Right, specialists working together.
Yeah, specialists in different areas working together, but separate from marketing and sales, moving away from that image of just one programmer doing everything.
And they made a really specific choice early on about which platforms to target, not consoles initially.
They did. EA strategically focused on the home computer market first, the Atari 800, Commodore 64, Apple II, those kinds of machines.
Why computers first? What was the significance there?
Well, it gave them independence. They could tap into that growing user base, sure. But crucially, they avoided the really strict licensing policies and, frankly, the creative control that console makers like Nintendo often had back then.
Ah, right. More freedom.
Exactly. That autonomy was vital for nurturing that software artist culture they wanted, and it let them iterate on ideas much faster.
And it seems like that flexibility paid off pretty quickly with some early hits. They shipped the first batch in May '83.
Yeah, you saw successes like Archon. That was a really unique chess-like strategy game. Then there was One-on-One, Dr. J versus Larry Bird, which was, for its time, a remarkably realistic sports simulation.
Ahead of its time, maybe.
A little bit, yeah. And Marble Madness was another hit. Skyfox was a huge bestseller on the Apple II in 1984, and they showed they could adapt too, supporting new hardware like the Amiga and even reverse engineering the Sega Genesis later on before they eventually struck a formal deal.
Reverse engineering a console. That's bold. How did they fund all this beyond Hawkins' initial investment?
Well, Hawkins and the early team spent about 7 months refining the business plan, and they managed to secure around $2 million in venture capital.
Okay, that helps.
And another key innovation, this time on the business side, was their direct-to-retailer sales strategy. That was largely pushed by Larry Probst, who joined in late '84.
Direct to retail. That means cutting out the distributors, right? More margin, more control.
Exactly. It was aggressive, definitely forward-thinking for the time, gave them higher profit margins and much better insight into what was actually happening in the market.
And that whole developer recognition thing, your sources say it wasn't just talk, it was tangible.
It really was. The developers were prominently credited right there on the game packaging, which was pretty unique back then. It genuinely did help attract top talent and fostered that innovative culture Hawkins was aiming for.
Okay, so before we leave this early era of software artists and home computers, there's a thread here, isn't there? Something that leads directly to the next huge phase for EA.
Ah, yes. It actually ties back to Trip Hawkins himself. Apparently, he had this deep personal passion for sports simulations going way back to his teenage years.
Oh,
Yeah, he even tried to create his own version of a Stratomatic football board game and envisioned a digital version just to handle all the complex calculations. That personal interest, maybe subtly at first, was laying the groundwork for what would become EA Sports and eventually the pursuit of getting someone like John Madden involved.
and that leads us right into segment 2, the sporting empire.
A truly massive chapter in the EA story, yeah. The EA Sports brand officially launched around 1988, but there was a more sort of formalized branding push around 1991. And it was definitely fueled by Hawkins' passion for realistic sports sims.
And there was a specific group internally who really championed formalizing that EA Sports brand in '91.
Yes, there was a team, included names like Don Traeger, Michael Kasaka, and Don Transith. They came up with the idea of bringing all of EA's different sports games under one single unified brand.
Okay.
Initially, they actually called it the EA Sports Network, ESN, explicitly inspired by channels like ESPN.
ESN, I like it. And their goal wasn't just making sports games, it was making real sports games.
Precisely. Their whole declaration was basically, we're making real sports games for real sports fans. The focus was squarely on authenticity and simulation, deliberately moving away from the more arcadey sports games that were common at the time.
And the branding itself, that red, white, and blue look became so iconic.
Yeah, Michael Osborne, the designer, apparently drew inspiration from popular sports apparel and magazines, things like starter jackets, Nike, Converse, Sports Illustrated. Using that classic American sports look and streamlining the name to just EA Sports was key. And honestly, creating a distinct gaming brand separate from the hardware companies like Sega or Nintendo was actually a pretty new idea back then.
There's a funny story about getting the internal teams to actually use the new branding.
Huh? Yeah. Transith apparently recalled they basically had to bribe the game producers with ESN-branded swag jackets, T-shirts, hats, that kind of thing.
Seriously.
Yeah, just to get them to actually include the new logos and branding in their games.
Hey, want this cool jacket? Just slap the EA Sports logo on your game.
That's brilliant. And it clearly worked because these franchises became absolute global giants.
Oh, absolutely. Madden NFL is probably the foundational one, certainly for the U.S. market. Its origins go back to Hawkins reaching out to John Madden himself way back in 1984. And Madden was famously picky about the realism, wasn't he? That apparently delayed the first game for quite a while.
He was. The story goes he insisted on having 11 players on the field for each team, which was a huge technical challenge for the hardware they had back then.
I can imagine.
So the first game didn't actually come out until 1988. But they started doing annual releases in 1990, and it just exploded, became a cultural touchstone.
The scale of Madden's success is just mind-blowing.
I mean, the numbers are staggering. Over 130 million copies sold by 2018, generated over $4 billion in revenue by 2013. And your sources show Madden NFL 24 was the best-selling one in decades, boosting net bookings 6% in fiscal year 24.
Wow.
And get this, EA's American football franchises combine mostly Madden, but now college football, too, surpassed $1 billion in net bookings in FY25 alone.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
That's from American football games. Incredible. And then there's the global game, FIFA, or now EA Sports FC.
Right. EA got into global football simulation late in '93 with FIFA International Soccer. It just took off, rapidly becoming the world's best-selling sports game series. Over 325 million copies sold by 2021. FIFA 12 was even called the fastest-selling sports game ever at the time.
But then, just a couple of years ago, a massive change happened.
Yeah, that nearly 30-year partnership with the governing body, FIFA, ended in 2022. EA made the strategic call to rebrand and launch EA Sports FC in 2023.
And how did that go? There was definitely some chatter about whether player loyalty was to the FIFA name or to EA's actual game.
It seems to have gone remarkably well, actually. The franchise kept its momentum, showing high teens percentage growth in net bookings in FY24 and really strong player spending into FY25.
So players stuck with the gameplay.
It strongly suggests that player loyalty was primarily tied to EA's core gameplay mechanics and, crucially, those underlying league and player licenses, not just the FIFA brand itself.
Which is why securing those direct deals with leagues was so important for the rebrand.
Absolutely critical, making sure they highlighted their partnerships with the Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, Serie A, League One, plus the women's leagues like WSL and NWSL, and CONMEBOL in South America. That was key to showing they still have the authentic teams and players everyone cared about.
Beyond football, the NHL series is another really long-running, foundational one for EA Sports.
Yeah, debuted back in '91. The NHL series quickly became the benchmark for ice hockey sims, usually praised for its realism. Things like the deep player management features introduced in NHL 95 were pretty significant back then, and NHL 25 is apparently introducing new stuff like an icy EQ system and a revamped franchise mode.
They've built up quite a stable of sports titles over the decades.
For sure. NBA Live has been around forever, though, with ups and downs. They're bringing back college football as EA Sports College Football 25 and FY25, which is huge news. They picked up Formula One through the Codemasters acquisition, and they have the UFC license, too.
It really sounds like securing those official licenses is the absolute bedrock of the whole EA Sports empire.
It's fundamental to their success. Those licenses provide that unparalleled authenticity, the real teams, real players, real stadiums, real leagues. That realism has always been their key differentiator in the market, their main competitive advantage.
And that brings us back around to the Madden NFL exclusive license. That's a big one.
It is. EA has held the exclusive NFL and NFL Players Association license for Madden simulation games since the 2004-2005 seasons. And that effectively gave EA a monopoly on licensed NFL simulation games for a very long time.
But holding that kind of exclusivity hasn't been without controversy, has it?
Definitely not. It's led to antitrust lawsuits, with people arguing it stifles competition and innovation in the football gaming space. It's been a massive source of market dominance for EA, but also a constant source of criticism.
And where does that stand now?
Well, as of early 2025, your sources note the current NFL license is actually set to expire after the 2026 season. Now, EA management sounds confident they'll extend it.
But it's still a potential risk.
It absolutely highlights a potential vulnerability alongside their continued dominance in that space.
So they went from this innovative software artist culture to building this absolute behemoth of a sports division.
They really positioned EA Sports as a dominant force, and it was formalized as its own separate division in 2023, distinct from the rest of EA Entertainment, specifically to underscore how strategically important it is. And that relentless focus on authenticity over the years, it helped cultivate this huge, loyal fan base, a fan base that was perfectly primed for the shift towards live service models like Ultimate Team later on.
Okay, so sports definitely built the empire, but EA didn't just stop there, did they? They used acquisitions to expand well beyond the playing field.
Right, that's a whole other huge part of the story. They strategically diversified by buying up studios and developing major non-sports franchises. It was all about broadening their reach and, of course, their revenue streams.
But that wasn't always smooth sailing. Integrating different studios, different cultures.
No, that often presented some pretty significant challenges for sure.
Let's start with Maxis. The Sims. Sin City, huge names.
EA acquired Maxis back in June 1997 for about $125 million. Maxis was actually having some financial trouble then, despite the success of SimCity 2000 earlier. EA was definitely interested in that valuable SimCity IP, but also in Will Wright's experimental Dollhouse prototype.
And that prototype eventually became The Sims.
Which launched in February 2000 and just blew everyone away, completely defying a lot of the initial skepticism. It became the best-selling PC franchise of all time, over 200 million units sold globally.
Its gameplay was just so different, right? Just simulating everyday life.
Totally fresh. And it really pioneered that incredibly lucrative expansion pack model. Looking back, it feels like a very early precursor to the kind of ongoing content and monetization we see everywhere in live services today.
And The Sims is still going strong.
Incredibly strong. Your sources mention it reported double-digit growth in Q4 of fiscal year 2025, even as it celebrated its 25th anniversary.
Amazing longevity. But what about SimCity under EA? How did that fare?
Well, the series continued for a while. SimCity 3000 came out after the acquisition. SimCity 4 in 2003 was the first major one without Will Wright directly involved. But the 2013 reboot, that was a different story.
Ah, was that the one that pushed the multiplayer and the always online requirement really hard?
Yes, partly framed as an anti-piracy measure, but the launch was just disastrous. Widespread server failures, tons of bugs. It really damaged the SimCity brand's reputation pretty severely, and it effectively killed off major new PC development for that series from EA.
So the acquisition really changed Max's quite profoundly.
Completely. I mean, some people saw it as EA rescuing the company from financial trouble, but it also involved significant layoffs over time, studio closures, including the main Emeryville studio in 2015. The studio's culture definitely shifted, and the focus narrowed dramatically, almost entirely onto The Sims.
Then came BioWare, known for those deep narrative RPGs like Mass Effect and Dragon Age.
EA acquired BioWare in October 2007 for a hefty sum, around $775 million via its parent company at the time. BioWare had the stellar reputation for rich, story-driven RPGs. And Mass Effect, which had just launched its first game, became a real flagship franchise under EA.
That original Mass Effect trilogy is legendary among RPG fans.
Absolutely. Critically acclaimed for its huge sci-fi universe, the meaningful player choices, the characters. The trilogy from 2007 to 2012 was an immense success.
But then came Andromeda.
Right, Mass Effect. Andromeda in 2017. It was the first game in the series, built on EA's internal Frostbite engine, and while it received a pretty mixed reception, had a lot of technical issues at launch, and faced criticism regarding its story and character development compared to the original trilogy.
Did that impact the franchise's future?
Your sources indicate it led to a temporary pause on the franchise and some restructuring at the BioWare Montreal studio. Development on a new Mass Effect game has started since then, though.
Okay, and what about BioWare's other big RPG series, Dragon Age?
Dragon Age debuted in 2009 with Dragon Age Origins. It established this really rich fantasy world, known for its deep lore and character development. Origins and later Dragon Age. Inquisition in 2014 were both big, critical, and commercial hits. Dragon Age 2 in 2011 was a bit more divisive among the fan base, though.
And the most recent one, Dragon Age, The Veilguard, just came out in October 2024. How did that perform?
Critically, reviews were generally favorable, but unfortunately, it significantly underperformed EA's sales expectations. Your sources say it engaged about 1.5 million players in its first few months, which was roughly 50% below what EA had projected internally.
Oof. That's a major miss for such a big franchise release.
It certainly had an impact. It contributed to EA revising its future financial forecasts downwards and, sadly, led to further restructuring and layoffs at BioWare in early 2025.
So it sounds like the BioWare acquisition brought resources, yes, but also significant new pressures and integration challenges.
Absolutely. A major issue highlighted repeatedly in the sources was that mandated use of EA's Frostbite engine.
Right, the engine built for Battlefield.
Exactly. Frostbite was primarily designed for first-person shooters, adapting it for the incredibly complex systems that RPGs need, things like intricate save systems, branching dialogue trees, managing huge inventories, detailed cutscenes. It proved incredibly difficult and time-consuming for BioWare.
They had to build systems from scratch.
Reportedly, yeah. Studios felt like they were essentially fighting their own toolset just to build fundamental RPG mechanics, and apparently creating animations, especially for non-humanoid creatures common in fantasy RPGs, also presented major hurdles on that engine.
Were there other internal tensions reported?
Well, sources mention claims from within BioWare suggesting that EA sometimes favored the Mass Effect series over Dragon Age when it came to allocating resources. And many external observers, and even some insiders, felt there was a gradual erosion of BioWare's distinct development culture over time. One longtime studio veteran was even quoted saying they felt EA had finished digesting BioWare by 2017. And of course, many key figures, including the studio's co-founders Ray Muzica and Greg Zeshuk, eventually left the company after the acquisition.
Moving over to the action side of things, EA really bolstered its strength in first-person shooters with acquisitions like DICE and Respawn.
Absolutely. DICE, the creators of the Battlefield series and, importantly, the Frostbite engine itself, were acquired back in October 2006. Battlefield became a cornerstone FPS franchise for EA, famous for those huge multiplayer battles, vehicle combat, and especially its signature feature, destructible environments, all powered by Frostbite.
Battlefield is another huge seller, over 88 million copies.
It is. But the most recent major installment, Battlefield 2042 and 2021, had a notoriously troubled launch. suffered from significant bugs, some controversial design changes like introducing specialists instead of traditional classes, and a general feeling of lacking content initially.
They've worked on fixing it since then, right?
Oh yeah, EA and Dicey have put a lot of work into fixing it post-launch, but it definitely impacted the franchise's reputation at the time. A new Battlefield title is currently planned for release in fiscal year 2026.
And then Respawn Entertainment, acquired more recently in 2017.
Respawn was founded by Vince Zampella and Jason West, some of the original creators of Call of Duty, so they brought some serious FPS pedigree to EA. Their huge breakout hit under EA, of course, was Apex Legends.
Right, the free-to-play battle royale, it just appeared out of nowhere.
Exactly, a surprise launch in February 2019. Set in the same universe as their Titanfall games, it became a massive global success incredibly quickly, hitting over 70 million players in no time. It's now a absolutely key live service revenue driver for EA.
And it came from Titanfall somehow.
Yeah, interestingly, sources note it actually evolved from a survival mode prototype that was originally being developed for the Titanfall series.
Speaking of Titanfall, the original games were critically loved, but maybe didn't sell as well as expected.
Yeah, they were highly acclaimed, especially for their movement mechanics and the Titan gameplay, but they often faced really tough competition due to unfortunate launch timing. And interestingly, your sources mentioned that a new Titanfall incubation project was reportedly canceled by EA in early 2025.
So the future of standalone Titanfall might be uncertain.
It does suggest some uncertainty about a dedicated sequel, even though Apex Legends continues to thrive within that same universe.
But Respawn proved they weren't just a multiplayer FPS studio.
Definitely not. They also developed the hugely successful and critically acclaimed single-player Star Wars Jedi series Fallen Order, and its sequel, Survivor, shows real versatility.
So these acquisitions brought in massive IPs and talent, but it sounds like a complex legacy overall. Any other significant franchises we should quickly touch on from this diversification effort?
Well, Need for Speed is one of EA's longest-running franchises, selling over 150 million copies since it debuted way back in 1994. It's had many developers and stylistic shifts over the years, and EA really solidified its dominance in the racing genre by acquiring Codemasters in 2021 for $1.2 billion, bringing in their expertise in IPs like F1, Dirt Need, and GRD.
What about Medal of Honor? I remember that being a huge competitor to Call of Duty back in the day.
It was. That series actually originated from an idea by Steven Spielberg and was developed by DreamWorks Interactive, which EA acquired in 2000. It had big early success as a World War II FPS, especially with Allied Assault in 2002.
That it kind of faded away.
Yeah, they attempted a modern warfare reboot in 2010, and its sequel, Warfighter, in 2012 was unfortunately a critical and commercial failure. That led EA to effectively put the series out of rotation, as they termed it. There was a VR title in 2020, but the core series is largely dormant now.
And the classic real-time strategy series, Command & Conquer.
That came to EA through the acquisition of Westwood Studios in 1998, the original creators. Westwood was then controversially closed by EA in 2003, which caused a lot of upset among fans. Development continued for a while under EA Los Angeles.
But the newer games didn't quite capture the magic.
Command & Conquer 4 in 2010 was pretty poorly received, largely due to significant changes to the core gameplay formula. They did release a well-received remastered collection of the originals in 2020, but much like Medal of Honor, new titles in the main series seem to be on hold indefinitely.
So looking back at this whole history of acquisitions, it clearly fueled growth and brought in amazing IP, but there seems to be this recurring pattern of studio changes, closures, from maybe talent departures.
It's definitely a complex legacy, no doubt. Acquisitions were absolutely fundamental to EA's growth strategy. They consistently bought external studios to get IP, talent, and market share, often favoring that over trying to build major new IP internally on the same scale outside of their core sports franchises.
But the criticism followed.
Yes, critics have consistently pointed to the potential negative consequences post-acquisition, the assimilation, or some would say homogenization, of distinct studio cultures, a perceived reduction in creative autonomy, and the eventual departure of key founders and creative leaders. It's often referred to, sometimes negatively, as the EA effect.
Have they acknowledged this?
To some extent, even former EA CEOs have, in retrospect, acknowledged some past missteps in how they integrated acquired studios.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now. Beyond buying studios, one of the absolute biggest transformations at EA has been how they actually sell games and make money from them.
Absolutely. This takes us into segment 4. The playbook evolves. EA has undergone this profound shift, moving away from relying mostly on selling you a game in a box, a premium purchase, to heavily embracing digital distribution, live services, microtransactions, and subscription models.
And that really started with them building their own digital platforms.
Yeah, it began relatively small with something called EA Downloader back in 2005, but it evolved quite a bit. A really major step was the launch of Origin in June 2011.
Right, their competitor to Steam.
Exactly. It was their direct-to-consumer PC platform. And initially, they made it exclusive for many of their biggest PC releases, like Battlefield 3, basically to force players to adopt it and build up their own ecosystem. It offered features like cloud saves, automatic patching, and by 2013, they claimed over 50 million users.
But Origin didn't last forever, did it? It got replaced.
Correct. They announced its replacement in 2020, and the EA app launched for Windows in October 2022. The old Origin client was officially retired in April 2025. Part of the reason cited was Microsoft ending support for older 32-bit operating systems, which also, interestingly, brought up some questions about accessing older digital games bought on Origin.
How did players feel about these platforms? Origin, then the EA app.
Reception was definitely mixed. Origin was often criticized for being an inconvenient, mandatory launcher. You had to run alongside Steam sometimes. There were also periodic concerns about its security and privacy policies. The EA app is generally seen as faster and more streamlined.
Right.
But the decision to drop 32-bit support did raise concerns for some players about digital ownership and potentially losing access to older games they'd purchased. From EA's business perspective, though, this whole transition to digital distribution was absolutely pivotal.
How so?
Well, it drastically cut down their reliance on physical retail, shelf space, shipping costs, all that. But maybe most importantly, it established a direct relationship with the customer. And that direct line is absolutely crucial for powering live services and generating recurring revenue.
Which brings us right to the core of their modern business.
Yeah.
Live services and microtransactions.
This is where EA has been strategically very aggressive and financially incredibly successful. The whole focus shifted from just selling the game to keeping you playing and potentially spending long after the initial purchase through ongoing content updates, in-game events, and various microtransactions.
It's all about long-term engagement now.
And creating those predictable recurring revenue streams.
And the financial numbers really show just how dominant this model has become to them.
It's absolutely the core of their financial health today. Live services revenue as a percentage of their total grew from 64% back in fiscal year 2019 to a staggering 73.8%. That's $5.461 billion in fiscal year 2025.
Wow, nearly 3/4 of their revenue.
Exactly. And that trend is increasing, while traditional full game sales make up a progressively smaller slice of the pie.
And the absolute engine driving that live service revenue, particularly for EA Sports, has got to be Ultimate Team.
Without a doubt. That mode where you build your fantasy team using player cards you get through gameplay progression or by purchasing randomized packs, it's just an enormous revenue generator, especially in games like EA Sports, FC, and Madden.
Just how enormous are we talking?
Your sources mention one appraisal suggesting that the Ultimate Team modes across all their games generated something like $1.6 billion in revenue in the year 2021 alone.
$1.6 billion in 1 year. From virtual cards.
It's designed to be incredibly engaging, very sticky, as they say, and it was a major driver of that high teens net bookings growth for EA Sports FC in FY24, and it continues to show really robust monetization into FY25.
But this exact mechanism, the buying packs for random players, has put EA right at the center of a huge industry controversy.
Yeah.
The whole loot box debate.
It absolutely has. The randomized nature of opening those packs in Ultimate Team, often called loot boxes in broader discussions, has drawn widespread criticism globally, mainly for its resemblance to gambling, and especially concerning its potential impact on younger players.
And that criticism hasn't just stayed online, has it? It's led to real-world legal challenges and regulatory heat.
It has, yeah. EA has faced legal battles and intense regulatory scrutiny in various countries. Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria are mentioned in your sources, and government bodies like the U.S. Federal Trade Commission have also voiced significant concern.
What's EA's defense?
Well, EA consistently maintains that Ultimate Team is primarily a skill-based game mode, where how you build and manage your team matters most. But that element of paying real money for randomized rewards is undeniably the contentious part.
And this wasn't even the first time EA faced a massive firestorm over its monetization practices, was it?
Oh, far from it. The launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2 back in 2017 is probably the most infamous example. It originally featured a progression system that felt very pay-to-win because it was so heavily tied to loot boxes containing powerful items, and the player outcry was just immense.
That's where that infamous Reddit comment came from, right? The pride and accomplishment one.
That's the one. A comment from an EA community manager trying to justify the grind became, at the time, the single most downvoted comment in Reddit history. The backlash was so severe, so immediate, that EA was actually forced to temporarily remove all in-game purchases just days before the game officially launched.
Did it hurt the game's sales?
Sources suggest the controversy definitely impacted Battlefront 2's overall sales figures. And perhaps more importantly, that whole incident really ignited the global debate around loot boxes and arguably accelerated the push for regulation across the entire industry. Developers at Dicey working on the game reportedly felt player sentiment towards EA had hit rock bottom during that period.
And there were even earlier examples of them pushing monetization boundaries.
Yeah, even earlier, back around 2009, comments from the then CEO John Riccitiello, where he speculated about potentially charging players to reload their weapons in Battlefield 3 based on preview feedback. That also drew significant anger from the gaming community at the time.
So it feels like there's this recurring pattern. EA tries out new, sometimes quite aggressive monetization models.
Which are often very lucrative.
Right, but then they face significant player backlash, sometimes regulatory scrutiny, and they have to kind of adjust or pull back.
And that does seem to be the trend, looking at the history.
Yeah.
These models, especially Ultimate Team, are incredibly profitable. But finding that right balance, maximizing revenue without totally alienating your player base or attracting heavy-handed regulation, that's the ongoing tightrope walk. Maintaining player trust feels absolutely critical for the long-term health of these live service games.
Beyond direct microtransactions, they also built out subscription services quite early on.
They did. They launched EA Access for consoles around 2014, and then Origin Access for PC gamers in 2016. These were eventually consolidated under the single EA Play brand in August 2020.
And what do you typically get with an EA Play subscription?
Usually it offers access to a library of older EA titles, what they call the playlist. You also often get limited time early access trials for brand new releases, typically around 10 hours of playtime before launch, and usually a small discount, like 10% if you buy EA digital content. They have different tiers, a standard EA Play and a more expensive EA Play Pro with more benefits, like full access to new games on launch day.
And they massively expanded the reach of EA Play by partnering with Microsoft, didn't they?
That was a huge strategic move, yeah. Integrating the standard EA Play library into Microsoft's Xbox Game Pass Ultimate and PC Game Pass subscriptions, essentially at no extra cost to those subscribers, dramatically exposed EA's games and services to a massive, already engaged audience.
What are the main strategic benefits for EA in pushing these subscriptions?
Well, obviously, it provides a consistent, recurring revenue stream, which investors love. It also encourages player retention, keeping players within the EA ecosystem, trying different games. It offers a perceived value proposition, which can sometimes help soften their image around monetization. And of course, it gathers incredibly valuable data on player engagement across their portfolio.
Did it impact traditional retail?
Your sources even note a temporary dip in GameStop's stock price when EA Access was first announced, reflecting the market's perception that it would likely shift some sales away from physical copies towards digital subscriptions.
And feels like this whole overarching shift towards live services and subscriptions must have fundamentally changed how games themselves are actually designed at EA.
Oh, absolutely. When the majority of your revenue, or at least a huge chunk of it, comes from keeping players engaged after they've already bought the game, or even if the game is free to play like Apex, there's a very clear incentive to design games with long-term monetization and retention baked in from the start.
So things like seasonal content, battle passes.
Exactly. Seasonal content, cosmetic items you can buy, progression systems that can be sped up or influenced by spending real money. You see these prominently in games like Apex Legends and, of course, throughout the Ultimate Team modes. This dynamic can sometimes feel like it's clashing with more traditional game design philosophies, fueling that ongoing debate about the balance between, artistic vision and commercial necessity in modern AAA games.
Okay, let's dive into the technology that's powering all of this, especially that Frostbite engine we keep mentioning.
Right. Frostbite was developed internally by Dicey, the studio that makes Battlefield. It first showed up with Battlefield Bad Company back in 2008. It was built from the ground up for first-person shooters specifically optimized for large-scale multiplayer, cutting-edge visuals for the time, and its real signature feature, those highly detailed, destructible environments.
And EA then made this strategic decision to try and use this single engine across almost all of its studios and genres.
Yeah, for a significant period, it became a strategic mandate across the company. The thinking behind it was, create a unified platform that would streamline licensing costs, hopefully make development pipelines more efficient, maybe make it easier to share talent and technology between studios. And it proliferated really quickly.
We saw it in RPGs.
Yep, RPGs from BioWare, racing games, and eventually even the major sports titles like FIFA and Madden started transitioning over to Frostbite, mostly around the 2015-2017 timeframe.
But we heard earlier, especially from the BioWare discussion, that this caused some major problems.
Huge problems. The fundamental issue was that the engine was so heavily optimized for FPS games, it proved really ill-suited for genres with vastly different technical requirements, like those complex RPGs. Studios reported immense difficulty adapting it for things RPGs take for granted: deep save game systems, intricate branching dialogue trees, managing massive inventories, complex cutscene direction.
It sounds like they were constantly fighting the tools.
That's the phrase often used. Developers felt they had to build these fundamental mechanics almost from scratch, essentially working against the engine's core design. And apparently, even things like creating and animating non-bipedal characters or designing environments that weren't primarily meant to be blown up became significant hurdles.
And that struggle directly impacted game quality and how long development took.
It seems to have been a major contributing factor in several high-profile cases. Those troubled development cycles, reports of intense crunch periods to meet deadlines, and the undeniable quality issues seen at launch for games like Mass Effect, Andromeda, Anthem, and even Battlefield 2042. Struggling with Frostbite adaptation was often cited as a key reason. Developers found the tools cumbersome, apparently, and fixing even basic bugs could be incredibly time-consuming.
Was the engine itself always stable when other teams were using it?
That was another reported issue. Sometimes, updates to the core Frostbite engine released by DICE could inadvertently destabilize the ongoing projects at other studios using it. And the central support team within EA dedicated to Frostbite was reportedly quite small and stretched thin, often unable to provide sufficient help, especially for the non-FPS teams who arguably needed the most assistance adapting it.
So eventually EA had to recognize that this one-size-fits-all engine strategy just wasn't working optimally.
Yes, thankfully. In December 2023, EA publicly announced a pretty significant shift in strategy. They stated that studios would now have more freedom to choose the best engine for their specific project, moving away from that near-universal Frostbite mandate.
That sounds like a positive step.
It was definitely seen as a clear acknowledgement that a single engine, no matter how powerful for its original purpose, wasn't the ideal solution for such a diverse portfolio of games. That said, Frostbite is still being used for many titles, including the recent Dragon Age, the Veilguard.
Beyond Frostbite, what other kinds of technology have been really important for EA's success?
Well, obviously, their robust online infrastructure is critical. The back-end systems powering the EA app, their game servers, matchmaking services, the delivery pipelines for all that live service content, that's all hugely important. They've also made very deep investments in data analytics.
Using player data.
Yeah, gathering insights into player behavior allows them to constantly optimize their live services, fine-tune the monetization models in games like Ultimate Team and Apex Legends, and tailor content updates to keep players engaged. Mobile development technology, often acquired through buying studios like Glue Mobile and Playdemic, is obviously key to their growing mobile segment, and they're actively interested and involved in cloud gaming, usually through partnerships with platform holders.
Looking at EA's corporate strategy more broadly now, beyond just the tech, acquisitions seem like this constant recurring theme throughout their history.
They are absolutely a cornerstone of how EA has grown. They have consistently favored acquiring external studios as a primary means of gaining valuable intellectual property, talented development teams, and significant market share.
We've mentioned many already.
Right. Maxis, BioWare, DICE, Respawn, Codemasters, Glue Mobile. The list goes on. This approach of buying success has often outweighed large-scale attempts at creating entirely new blockbuster IP internally, particularly outside of their core sports franchises.
But we've also touched on the potential downsides, that so-called EA effect.
It's the consistent counter-narrative, yes. Criticisms about EA assimilating the unique cultures of the studios they acquire, sometimes curtailing their creative autonomy, and often leading to the eventual departure of key founders and creative talent. These criticisms have followed EA through many of their major acquisitions. It points to this recurring tension between EA's centralized business objectives and the desire to preserve the specific creative environments that made those studios successful in the first place.
And strategic partnerships are vital too, separate from acquisitions.
Absolutely critical, especially those partnerships with major sports leagues. The exclusivity they often achieve provides that crucial competitive advantage, that moat around their business. But, as we saw with the end of the FIFA partnership and the looming expiration of the current NFL deal, these exclusive arrangements also create significant dependency and risk.
What about other partnerships?
Partnerships with major entertainment IP holders, like Disney for the Star Wars games, have produced massive hits like the Jedi series, but also, as we discussed, high-profile controversies like the Battlefront 2 launch. And even commercial tie-ins, like the recent PepsiCo partnership for EA Sports FC branding, are strategically important for marketing reach and generating additional revenue streams.
So there's this ongoing debate, it seems, about how EA actually manages its studios after acquiring them. Resources versus creative freedom.
It's definitely a persistent point of contention in the industry and among fans. While acquisitions undeniably bring the financial resources needed for today's massive AAA projects, critics argue that the push towards homogenization, using standardized tools like Frostbite was for a time, or aligning everyone strictly with corporate goals, can sometimes stifle the very creativity and unique identity that made those studios attractive targets in the first place.
And part of that history, unfortunately, includes numerous studio closures over the years.
Yes, sadly. Studio closures have been a recurrent and often controversial aspect of EA's operational history. Names like Westwood Studios, Origin Systems, Bullfrog Productions, Pandemic Studios, Visceral Games, Max's Emeryville, these were all significant studios shut down by EA over the years. And more recently, Cliffhanger Games, which was reportedly working on a Black Panther title, was closed in May 2025, alongside significant cuts at BioWare earlier that year.
Why do these closures happen?
The reasons EA usually cites are things like strategic realignment, underperformance of recent titles, or needing to sharpen focus on core franchises or growth areas. But regardless of the stated business rationale, these closures and the pressures that often precede them inevitably impact employee morale across the entire company and can lead to the loss of valuable talent, institutional knowledge, and leadership.
So even with efforts like the 2023 reorganization into EA Entertainment and EA Sports, the pressure for financial efficiency still seems to heavily influence these kinds of difficult decisions.
That certainly appears to be the case. The fact that layoffs and studio closures continued into 2025 suggests that the intense pressures of the modern AAA game market and the relentless drive for financial performance and operational efficiency remain dominant factors guiding EA's strategic decisions. The 2023 reorg might have been an attempt to create better focus and oversight, but the underlying financial realities of the business seem unchanged. And that leads us nicely into segment 6, looking directly at those challenges and EA's overall financial standing. EA has certainly weathered its fair share of public controversies over the years.
And that loot box debate we talked about feels like it's always simmering near the surface.
It really does. And when you reemphasize the sheer financial scale involved, like Ultimate Team generating potentially $1.6 billion in revenue in just 2021, you see the immense success tied to that model. But it exists in this constant direct tension with the ongoing public scrutiny over its gambling-like mechanics, the increasing number of legal challenges worldwide, and the persistent pressure from regulators.
And the Battlefront 2 fiasco really crystallized that tension.
Absolutely. That whole episode, forcing them to pull microtransactions before launch, the reported sales impact, the rock-bottom player sentiment described by developers, it was a pivotal moment. It arguably shaped the entire industry's subsequent approach to loot boxes and definitely accelerated calls for government regulation.
Game quality and particularly troubled launches also seem to be a recurring challenge for EA.
Battlefield 2042 and Anthem stand out as probably the most prominent recent examples of massive, highly anticipated EA titles launching in states that were widely perceived by players and critics as buggy, unstable, or simply lacking content.
And that damages trust.
Hugely. These kinds of launches significantly damage the reputation of not just the specific franchise involved, but also EA as a publisher overall. And we saw similar issues, maybe to varying degrees, with earlier launches like Mass Effect, Andromeda, and that 2013 SimCity reboot.
What do you think are the underlying factors that contribute to these kinds of troubled launches happening repeatedly?
It's likely a complex mix of things. Sometimes it might be overly ambitious development timelines, perhaps driven by pressure to hit specific quarterly or annual financial targets, leading to features being cut or rushed. Difficulties in adapting or working with specific technology, like the well-documented struggles many studios had adapting the Frostbite engine, certainly played a significant role in some cases. And sometimes there might be a disconnect between the original creative vision for a game and the publisher's mandated requirements, feature lists, or business goals, leading to development friction and compromises. And we can't really discuss EA's challenges without mentioning workplace culture, specifically the issue of crunch.
Right, the EA Spouse blog post back in 2004 really blew the lid off the issue of grueling, often reportedly mandatory, overtime, what became known as crunch culture within parts of EA at the time. This expose led directly to class action lawsuits, significant financial settlements, and changes in how certain employee roles were classified regarding eligibility for overtime pay.
Did things improve after that? EA definitely made public efforts to improve work-life balance, particularly under new leadership that came in around 2007. However, reports and allegations of crunch culture have periodically resurfaced over the years, often linked to the intense development cycles of their biggest, most complex releases, like the reports around Anthem's development. It seems the inherent pressures of AAA game development, coupled with the constant drive to meet ambitious financial targets, remain persistent factors contributing to this issue across the industry, not just at EA.
Finally, circling back to those exclusive licensing deals, particularly the Madden NFL one, that continues to be both a strength and a source of challenge.
It's the perfect example of that duality. The exclusive license gives EA undisputed market dominance in the lucrative NFL simulation genre, a huge commercial advantage. But it has consistently drawn criticism and legal challenges for potentially stifling competition and innovation in that space.
Accusations of monopoly power.
Exactly. There have been antitrust lawsuits alleging that EA used this exclusive deal to create a monopoly, control the market, and dictate pricing. EA's defense has generally been that the sports leagues themselves sought these exclusive deals for stability and guaranteed revenue, and EA simply won the competitive bidding process. There have been settlements over the years related to these issues, including regarding the use of player likenesses for historical players like Jim Brown and in the NCAA context.
So it creates this inherent tension between EA maximizing its commercial advantage and the broader consumer desire for more choice and competition in the sports gaming market.
Absolutely, and it's really worth noting how interconnected many of these challenges often are. For instance, that intense pressure to hit aggressive financial targets can contribute to rushed development schedules, which can lead to game quality issues, which in turn might necessitate periods of intense crunch to fix things post-launch. Similarly, implementing aggressive monetization strategies can directly lead to player backlash, which then attracts regulatory scrutiny. It's all often linked. Okay, let's shift now to their overall financial standing. It's been quite a journey from that small startup Trip Hawkins funded to the multi-billion-dollar corporation it is today.
Yeah, after its early growth and going public in 1989, EA quickly became a major player. By fiscal year 2000, driven by hits like The Sims, they were reporting around $1.4 billion in annual revenue. Fiscal year 2005 was described as a record year, with forecasts between $3.2 and $3.4 billion.
And then came that pivotal shift towards digital distribution and services.
Right. Around fiscal year 2010, they actually reported a GAAP net loss, which sounds bad, but the significant underlying story was that their non-GAAP digital revenue was showing really strong growth. The transition was underway. By fiscal year 2015, digital revenue hit a record $2.2 billion, and their operating cash flow was over $1 billion. The pivot was clearly working financially.
And how has their performance looked more recently, say in the last few years, covered by your sources? For fiscal year 2024, which ended in March 2024, they reported total revenue of $7.5 billion, with that huge 73.8% chunk coming from live services. For fiscal year 2025, ending March 2025, revenue was slightly down at $7.4 billion, and net bookings were $7.3 billion, again, heavily dominated by live services. Cash flow remains very strong, reported at over $2 billion for FY25.
Were there any specific highlights from that most recent fiscal year, FY25, that stood out in the reports?
Yes, your sources pointed to record net bookings for EA Sports overall, with the American football segment primarily Madden and the returning college football games surpassing the $1 billion mark for the first time. The Sims franchise continued its strong performance, showing double-digit growth, especially around its 25th anniversary buzz. EA Sports FC apparently saw increased player monetization compared to the previous year post-rebrand. And interestingly, a relatively new IP called Split Fiction, which launched late in the fiscal year, March 2025, showed promising early results, selling nearly 4 million units quickly.
That's a positive sign for new IP. What does their stock performance tell us about how investors generally view the company?
Well, they trade under the ticker EA on the NASDAQ. In late May 2025, the stock was trading somewhere in the $143 to $146 range. It actually hit an all-time high back in November 2024. Over the very long term, obviously, it's shown immense appreciation, something like 27,600% since its early days after the IPO.
Wow, but it's still influenced by game launches and performance.
Oh, absolutely. The stock price is definitely influenced by successful game launches. Apex Legends gave it a big boost when it surprise launched strong earnings reports and broader market trends, but it's also vulnerable to things like major project delays, public controversies, or key titles underperforming expectations, like the impact noted recently from Dragon Age, the Veilguard's sales miss.
So the overall picture is financially very robust, strong cash flow, but their performance remains closely tied to the health of those key franchises and live services.
That seems to be the current state. Management certainly projects confidence, committing to return over 80% of their free cash flow back to shareholders through stock buybacks and dividends through fiscal year 2027. They even announced a substantial $5 billion share repurchase program recently.
And what's the financial outlook they've given for fiscal year 2026?
They are forecasting net bookings to be somewhere between $7.6 billion and $8.0 billion. The expected growth drivers are continued strength in EA Sports and The Sims, plus those major new launches they have planned. The new Battlefield title and the revival of the Skate franchise are specifically called out as key drivers for FY26.
But they also anticipate some headwinds.
Yes, they do expect those gains to be partially offset by some anticipated weakness from their older catalog titles, and significantly, they specifically mention anticipating weakness in Apex Legends during FY26. That suggests stabilizing and reinvigorating that crucial live service title is a major focus area for them right now.
And how do they stack up in terms of their position in the overall global games market?
Your sources estimate EA holds roughly 4% of the global software publishing market and maybe a slightly larger share, around 6%, specifically within the US market. Their real strength, competitively, lies in their near-total dominance of the licensed sports simulation genre. The overall market itself is obviously vast and continues to grow year over year.
And they're competing against some absolute giants.
Oh, yeah. Companies like Tencent, Sony with its PlayStation platform and first-party studios, Microsoft, especially now after acquiring Activision Blizzard, Nintendo with its unique ecosystem, and Take-Two Interactive with franchises like GTA and NBA 2K. These are all major global players.
What are EA's key advantages in that competitive landscape?
Their biggest advantages remain those powerhouse sports IPs and licenses, their proven ability to execute highly successful live services like Apex Legends and Ultimate Team, and arguably a more diversified overall portfolio of genres compared to some of their competitors who might be more reliant on just one or two mega franchises.
All right, that brings us to our final section, segment 7. Looking at the future, as of late May 2025, based on their most recent financial reports and strategic updates, what seem to be EA's immediate strategic priorities heading into the next couple of years.
It looks very clear, actually. Priority number one is absolutely live services dominance. They explicitly stated they expect continued growth in this area for both fiscal year 2026 and FY27.
So keep the money machines running, pretty much. Heavy focus on continuing to grow EA Sports FC monetization, sustaining that new $1 billion plus run rate for the American football segment, Madden and college football, and critically addressing that anticipated weakness in Apex Legends. That means stabilization efforts, plans for reinvigoration, and likely trying hard to improve player sentiment around that game. And The Sims' strong momentum is also flagged as a key priority for continued live service growth.
Okay, so live services are the core engine, but they can't just rely on existing games. They need new hits, too.
That's priority number 2. Major new launches to drive growth, particularly in FY26 and looking ahead to FY27.
Like the new Battlefield we mentioned.
Yes, that's slated for FY26 and is positioned as a critical launch for the company. They're expecting to spend significantly on marketing it. Also planned for FY26 is the long-awaited revival of the Skate franchise, which has a very passionate fan base.
And looking further out beyond the annual titles,
Looking towards FY27, they've signaled plans for major new non-annual titles aimed at diversifying their IP portfolio. These include the Iron Man game being developed by Motive, a new Star Wars Jedi title, presumably from Respawn, and the next installment in the Mass Effect franchise from BioWare.
mobile expansion is also still listed as a priority, right?
Yes, growing their mobile business is seen as a strategic win, and they plan to continue bolstering it, partly through further integration of those recent acquisitions like Glue Mobile and Playdemic.
And financially, their stated priorities seem to continue that theme of discipline we discussed.
Disciplined execution is a key phrase they used. That means carefully managing operating expenses, optimizing their spending on R&D and marketing, maintaining that strong free cash flow generation, and following through on their commitment to return capital to shareholders via those buyback programs and dividends.
What about the challenges they're explicitly anticipating as they look ahead? What are they bracing for?
Well, competition remains incredibly fierce across all segments of the market. Player expectations also continue to be incredibly high, not just for game quality at launch, but also regarding fair monetization practices and how EA handles the evolution of beloved, long-running franchises, the underperformance of Dragon Age. The Veilguard serves as a very recent, stark reminder of how challenging meeting those expectations can be.
And monetization itself keeps changing.
Exactly. Monetization models are constantly evolving, driven by market trends and player feedback. And that global regulatory landscape, especially around loot boxes and player spending, continues to be a significant potential factor that could impact future business models.
Okay, looking even further out now, beyond the immediate priorities, what potential future developments or even disruptions might be on EA's longer-term radar based on industry trends?
Generative AI is definitely something they, like everyone else, are actively exploring. Potential applications in speeding up game development, creating content more efficiently, personalizing player experiences. But it also comes with significant ethical questions and potential implications for the roles of human developers.
Cloud gaming and subscriptions, too.
The continued growth of cloud gaming platforms and subscription services like Game Pass will undoubtedly continue to influence how players access games, and that will require EA Play to keep evolving its value proposition to stay relevant. Concepts like the metaverse and Web3, while still pretty nascent and maybe overhyped previously, are still out there as potential future opportunities or disruptions that major companies like EA have to keep an eye on.
And regulation just seems like an ongoing reality they'll have to navigate.
It appears likely, yes, that ongoing scrutiny of loot box mechanics, increasing concerns around data privacy, and potential antitrust investigations related to exclusive deals or market dominance. These could all lead to new regulations in various regions that could directly impact EA's business practices, particularly how they monetize their highly lucrative sports titles.
There's also that constant internal balancing act, isn't there, between relying heavily on their established, incredibly profitable IPs versus taking the significant financial risks involved in creating entirely new franchises.
Right. Sustaining long-term growth requires both successfully leveraging those powerhouse franchises like Madden, FC, Apex, and The Sims, while also managing to find and launch completely new hits. Split Fiction's promising early success is a positive signal on that front, but consistently launching brand new successful IP in the ultra-expensive AAA space remains incredibly challenging for any publisher.
And finally, just maintaining stability and retaining top talent at their various development studios seems crucial.
Absolutely. Those recurring cycles of restructuring, layoffs like the recent ones impacting Cliffhanger and BioWare in early 2025, combined with the general pressures of AAA development. These things definitely impact studio stability and the company's ability to retain key creative and technical talent. Fostering a healthy, sustainable, and creative development environment across all their studios feels absolutely crucial for their future success, especially given how competitive the market is for experienced game developers.
So wrapping it all up then, as of late May 2025, the picture of EA is one of a financially robust company, built on the foundation of incredibly powerful live services and massive global franchises.
But their future success seems to hinge on several key factors playing out well. Consistently delivering high-quality games, particularly at launch, is paramount for rebuilding and maintaining player trust. Continued innovation within their live services is essential, but they need to do it in a way that feels fair and engaging, not overly exploitative.
Adapting to change is key too.
Successfully adapting to those rapid technological shifts like AI or cloud gaming and navigating the evolving market dynamics and regulatory pressures will be critical. And perhaps underlying it all, effectively managing their diverse portfolio of studios and retaining the talent needed to create hit games seems more important than ever. Learning from those past controversies around game quality issues, aggressive monetization tactics, studio closures, feels absolutely crucial for their long-term health.
Yeah, the future for EA will likely be defined by how well they navigate that complex balance, pushing for responsible innovation, consistently delivering compelling entertainment experiences that players value, and strategically managing that vast collection of valuable intellectual properties and, just as importantly, the people who bring them to life.
Wow. Okay, that was quite the deep dive into a company that has truly been central, for better or worse sometimes, to the entire evolution of the video game industry. We've traced that incredible journey right from Trip Hawkins' visionary idea of software artists.
All the way to the modern live service powerhouse we see today, built on that foundation of sports dominance, strategic, sometimes controversial acquisitions, and that fundamental transformation of their entire business model.
It's a story of just immense scale, undeniable cultural impact, and as we've seen, navigating some really significant controversies and challenges along that four-decade path.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
So considering EA's long, complex history of balancing those ambitious creative visions with often immense business pressures, and knowing that their strategic focus now seems so firmly centered on growing those live services and launching huge new tentpole titles like the upcoming Battlefield and Skate games, what do you think are the biggest challenges they face in trying to maintain both profitability and player trust in the years ahead? And maybe what does EA's whole journey tell us about the broader evolution of the video game industry itself?
Definitely something to think about, perhaps as you look at the games you play and the companies behind them, long after this deep dive is over.